Okay, so if you spent any time at all online, you have seen this fight. It's everywhere. Millennials and Gen Z on one side, baby boomers on the other. And the big accusation? That the older generation basically pulled the economic ladder up right behind them, leaving young people to figure it out for themselves. But is that what's really going on? Let's break down this whole generational wealth gap thing. At the very heart of all this anger is this promise, this belief that's been completely shattered. For literally 200 years, it was just a given that your kids would have a more prosperous life than you did. That fundamental promise of progress, it feels broken now. And that is a really scary feeling. And this feeling, this sense of a broken promise, it gets at what some economists call the intergenerational bargain. It's a pretty simple deal, right? Each generation leaves the world just a little bit better for the next one. And you can see this bargain just fraying at the edges in really tangible ways. I mean, just look at the classic milestones of adult life. Compared to their parents when they were the same age, young people today are way behind on buying a house, on starting a family, and even just feeling secure enough to think about retirement. All those traditional markers of a stable, good life, they're just slipping further and further away. But here's where we gotta hit pause and ask a really critical question. Is blaming an entire generation, like the boomers, the right way to even look at this? It's time to get beyond the labels. I mean, we really have to question this whole idea of a generational war. One source put it perfectly, saying that judging people based on their birth year is getting real close to astrology. Are we doing serious economic analysis here, or are we just reading financial horoscopes? The truth is, most of these cutoff dates for millennial or Gen Z are totally arbitrary. Like, someone born in 1996 is a millennial, but someone born just 1 year later in 1997 is Gen Z. Did the world really change that much in a year? Of course not. These labels, they make for a great story, a fun distraction, but they hide the real problems. Now, the baby boomers, they're kind of the one exception here. Their name actually comes from a real measurable event, that massive spike in births after World War II. But for pretty much everyone else, the labels are just lines drawn in the sand. And this brings us to a huge contradiction that kind of blows up that simple young versus old story. Let's just call it the millennial wealth paradox. So get this. Despite everything we just said about delayed milestones and financial struggles, the data shows that millennials are on track to become the wealthiest generation in history. Now, that's partly due to their own earnings, but it's also because of the massive transfer of wealth they're expected to inherit. And that's the key question, isn't it? How is it even possible for a generation to be, on paper, the richest ever, while so many people inside that generation feel like they are falling behind and living lives that are way less secure than their parents did? The answer to that question reveals, well, everything. And this chart just lays out the paradox perfectly. On one side, you have things that have gotten way more accessible, mostly consumer goods, right? A giant TV, a smartphone, a flight to another country. Things that were huge luxuries for a boomer are pretty common now. But then look at the other side. The absolute essentials, the bedrock of a secure life, housing, education, retirement, have become insanely, astronomically expensive. So, if young people can afford iPhones but not houses, and their generation is somehow getting richer overall, well, that tells you something. It means we're not looking at a generational problem. We're looking at the real culprit. Here is the absolute key to understanding all of this. The wealth of a generation is just an average, and an average can be completely warped by a tiny number of super rich people at the very top, while almost everyone else is left fighting over what's left. And if you want to see just how extreme this is, look at this number. For the baby boomers, it takes only about 20 people, 20 individuals, to account for almost half of their entire generation's net worth. Think about that. 20 people. This isn't just a boomer thing. It shows you how concentrated wealth has become. So the most important point is right here. This story we keep telling ourselves, the one about boomers versus millennials, it's just wrong. This isn't a war between generations. It's a crisis of inequality. Because the real economic divide, it isn't between the old and the young. It's between the people who own assets and the people who don't. And that's true within every single generation. There are tons of boomers with very few assets who are struggling, just like there are young people who are struggling.
wealth isn't flowing from young to old. It's flowing from the bottom 99% to the top 1% across all age groups.
Okay, so if this is really an inequality problem that just happens to look like a generational one, how on earth did we get to this point? What were the forces that carved out this massive divide?
Well, it really boils down to three major forces that have been working away for the last 50 years or so. First, a massive explosion in personal debt. Second, declining birth rates. And third, just the natural way capital tends to flow in our economy.
Let's start with debt, because it's a huge one. In the past, it was actually much harder to get a loan for everyday stuff. But today, student loans, credit cards, buy now, pay later, it's everywhere. And what that's done is create a huge group of young people who are starting their adult lives with a negative net worth. They're literally starting in financial hole that their parents and grandparents just didn't have. Now, you have to put this in historical context. That period right after World War II, when a lot of boomers were growing up, that was an anomaly. It was a weird period where inequality actually fell pretty dramatically. Before that, back in the Gilded Age, inequality was at record highs. And guess what? Today, we're right back there. We're in a new Gilded Age. That post-war period of lower inequality, that wasn't the natural state of things. The tough truth is that unless something actively intervenes, modern economies have this natural tendency to concentrate wealth. Money makes more money, and over time, it all just flows to the very top. Which brings us right back to where we started. The story of a big generational war, of boomers versus Gen Z. It's simple, it's emotional, it gets a ton of clicks online. But at the end of the day, it's a distraction. It's an entertaining sideshow that keeps us from looking at the much bigger, much harder problem of systemic inequality. And that leaves us with one last, really important question to think about. If pitting young people against old people is just a distraction that keeps us all from tackling the real crisis of wealth concentration, then who exactly benefits from that distraction? Who wins when the real problem never gets solved?